Hi everyone, welcome to my channel. In today's video, I am super excited to share with all of you my first impressions and review of the Sonia G Fundamentals collection set. So I picked up most of the brushes from this launch. These are for the most part existing brushes that were out of stock for a very long time, and then she recreated these with new wooden handles. So I picked up all three of the new fan brushes. So we have the Fan L, the Fan M, and the Fan A. And then I also picked up the new Worker L brush. This is apparently very similar to her existing Detail Pro brush, which I do already own, and Sonia G warned that you don't need both, but I really love that brush, and so I figured I'd pick this one up as well. So for today's video, I will be testing out these brushes with a lot of different products and formulas, a lot of different use cases, so hopefully this video is helpful for any of you who are interested in this new release and trying to decide between these brushes. So before we dive into the brushes, I did want to just briefly mention what is on my eyes today. As always, all of the products on my face will be linked below. But I was inspired today to do this look that is kind of based on a sunset sunrise look, and that's because my Sunlit Seduction palette will be arriving in the mail later this week. Fingers crossed it arrives on time. I ordered it over a week ago, so it has been quite a while to get a shipping notification, but here we are. So I'll definitely film 1 to 2 videos dedicated just to that palette, and I'll talk more in that video about my thoughts about the palette. But for today, I just wanted to mention that I was really inspired by a lot of the promo imagery that Pat McGrath was doing. It seemed like really beautiful, like sunset, sunrise kind of color stories. And I was a bit disappointed when I saw the actual palette because it didn't really have as much kind of oranginess or purpliness as I would have expected from a palette with that color story. And so today I went into my existing Pat McGrath collection and tried to put together a look that to me is a little bit more sunlit inspired. And so for today's look, I went in first with the Divine Rose 2 and used these two mattes, so that's all that I have in my crease. And then I went in with this flaky shade from Moonlit Seduction and put that in my inner thirds. And then I went into Ritualistic Rose and used this shade kind of all over the center of my lids. And to complete the look, I went back into the Skin Show shade from Divine Rose 2 and put that in the inner corner and brow bone. So I'm not totally sure when this video is going to go up, but I am going to try to release it before the Sunlit Seduction video. So I would love to hear in the comments what you guys think about that new release. Are you excited about it? Are you really jaded with all of the pinky palettes from Pat McGrath? There has been a lot of controversy, so we will definitely talk about the tea in that video. But for now, I would love to hear what you guys have been thinking. So without further ado, let's start talking about these brushes. So I was so excited when Sonia G came out with this release because for me, I have always been so intrigued by her fan brushes. In fact, when I first became interested in luxury makeup brushes, Sonia G's fan brushes were something that really stood out to me, and in fact, I really associated her brand with these really big fan brushes. With pretty much every other makeup brush brand I've encountered, the fan brushes are usually just very small and wispy. So take, for example, this Rephr number 20 brush, which I do love. This is excellent for highlight on the cheeks or over your nose. But this is really not something that you can use to do a full face, especially bronzer and blush. And so I was always really intrigued by these much bigger fan brushes, but I never actually got a chance to pick them up. They were sold out for the longest time, and because I had never used a brush like this, I kind of prioritized picking up other Sonia G brushes. But now that my Sonia G collection has grown so much, I am really excited to add these guys to my collection because I think they're just so unique and so Sonia G. And so let's walk through the details about these brushes. So first we have the Fan L. I assume that stands for Fan Large. This is the former Sculpt 1 brush. So this brush is interesting in that it is not made with Sai Coho goat hair, which is the goat hair that pretty much all of my other makeup brushes are made from. That is one of the softest forms of goat hair. This is instead bundled with Haku Totsuho, sorry for butchering that, goat bristles, and these are thicker, and I guess potentially less soft. I don't know. We'll have to put this to the test. It feels very soft, but I did want to call out that this is a different grade of goat bristle than is typical for most of Sonia G's brushes. My understanding is that the reason for that is that these are very long bristles, and because this is meant for bronzer, it does need to be able to kind of have some more rigidity and not just break off. In terms of uses for this, Sonia G says the main purposes are bronzer, powder, sculpting, finishing, and optionally blush, highlight, and setting powder. Next, we have the Fan M for medium, and this is the former Sculpt 2 brush. So I was on the fence for a while as to whether to pick this brush up because the way it's described is not really for use cases that I have that often. So specifically, this is designed by Sonia G to pick up blushes and powders that are really sheer, not so saturated, and are really time consuming to pick up. Personally, I actually don't find that that comes up for me very often. If anything, I actually enjoy sort of building up products instead of having them be really pigmented from the get-go. And because I do use pretty much exclusively natural hair brushes when I'm using powder products, I find that the natural hair brushes actually do a really good job of picking things up. So I don't really have the problem that this brush is designed to solve, but I'm still very intrigued by it because I've never actually used the fan brush to apply my blush, and so I'm very interested in terms of how that will go. And this is a dyed Psychoho goat hair, so it is a little bit more delicate in comparison to the Sculpt Large. And it's super, super soft, but very dense. So one thing that Sonia G does mention is that this is not ideal for bronzing all over because of how firm and dense it is. The main purposes are powder, highlight, sculpting, finishing, and the optional purposes are blush and bronzer. But today I'm going to use these for all of these purposes because I am really curious. Next, we have the Fan A, which is the former Sculpt 4. So A stands for angled, and this is a very, very unique shape. As you can tell, it's asymmetric, so this part is a lot shorter than this part. And so I was so intrigued by this brush. I've never seen a brush this shape before, and I'm really interested in seeing what kind of benefit the angle offers. For me, this looks like something that would be really natural for just doing nose contour and maybe a bit of chisel as well. But I'm very curious in terms of comparing these two, how the fact that this is symmetric and this is not will affect the utility. Sonia G does say that this, similar to the Fan M, is meant to be used with harder to pick up products, so it is relatively firm and dense. I would say comparing these two, the Fan M definitely feels denser and like a little bit sharper. So I don't know if you guys can tell here, but the Fan A feels a tiny bit fluffier in comparison, so it'll be interesting to see how that compares actually on the face. And in terms of the main purposes, this is primarily for sculpting, highlighting, finishing, and setting, and optionally for blush. Interestingly, she doesn't mention bronzer at all for this. Finally, we have the Worker L brush, and just to show you guys a side-by-side comparison, here it is next to the Detail Pro. They are extremely similar. I would say the only difference is the Worker L is a little less flat on the top. It's a bit more domed, but yeah, they do look very similar. Let's see how they feel. Yeah, they feel quite similar as well. So I mean, like I said, Sonia G did warn that you really don't need both of these, but the reason I picked up both is I really love this brush for a wide variety of use cases. It's one of my favorite brushes for nose contour and also for highlight, but I find for nose contour in particular, it's sometimes a little bit too wide and wispy, and so I was attracted to the fact that this is meant to be a little bit denser and a little bit more targeted. So I hope that additional kind of buffing motion makes it better for that nose contour area. These brushes are unique in that they come in this new walnut handle, which is quite different from Sonia G's typical handles, which have more of this lacquer finish. So this is her red lacquer for her Pro series. This is the blue lacquer from her Sky series. And this is the pink purple lacquer from her Lotus series. If you have her Kayaki sets, these wood handles do look quite similar to the ones from those sets. Now, there were two other brushes in this release as well. One was the Classic Cheek, which I actually have from her Keyaki set. So that set was discontinued. So now she's released this with a longer handle in this collection. And I do really love this brush, so I would highly recommend it. I've traveled with this brush a lot and often use this for basically all of my face products. And so I can vouch for the fact that this is great for powder all over the face, bronzer, blush, in a pinch, highlight as well. It's a very versatile brush because it has this sort of oval cross section, so you can either pat on products like this using this angle, or you can use it more at a 90-degree angle if you want something a bit more targeted. For me, when I use this for powder, I often dot it on my face like this, whereas I use more of a sweeping motion with my pigmented products. I wouldn't say this brush is my favorite for any particular use case, but I think it's just really great as a generalist, especially if you don't actually like picking up a bunch of different brushes for each step in your routine. The other release was her Soft Buffer Former Face 2 brush. So I don't have the Face 2, but I decided to pass on this one because I do have her Buffer Pro brush. And I like this brush, but I also find I don't use it that often. For me, I don't have a lot of use for buffing, and this brush especially is quite large on my face. So for rare occasions where I am using finishing powder to really buff things out, this is a great brush, but usually buffing is kind of a step I exclude from my routine because I guess I'm just not enough of a perfectionist to go back in and buff out all the edges afterward. And so that's why I decided to pass on the Face 2, because I figured if I want to buff, I have this brush and I just don't do it that often. So now let's test out these brushes. So as I mentioned, I have a bunch of different formulations here. So I'm gonna first go in with this Sculpt Large brush, and I'm gonna dip into my Chantecaille Bronzer because this is a little bit more of a firmly pressed bronzer, and so I'm curious how this brush will perform with it. Okay, well, interesting. Not that much product has picked up. Let me try to go in a little bit with more force. Okay. I don't see much pickup on the brush, but let's see how this translates on the skin. Okay, that's actually, I think, a good amount of pigmentation. I was really expecting this to pick up a lot more, but it does take a little bit of buildup. Interesting. Okay, well, I can definitely see why she used these stiffer bristles for this, because I feel like even though the bristles are maybe a little stiffer than her typical formula, they are really soft on the skin just because the bristles are so long. So even if you kind of push them this way at a 90-degree angle, you can't really get that much force just because of the length of the bristles. But that's great because it ends up meaning that the experience on the skin is very soft, even though the bristles themselves might be a little bit stiffer than typical. Okay, that's really pretty, and I think that did a really good job of providing targeted but still very easily blended out bronzing. So I didn't feel like I needed to exert pretty much any effort, and I didn't need to buff anything out. It just applied really beautifully. And I would say if you're someone who likes a bit more of a targeted application, even though this is the largest and wispiest of her fan brushes, I feel like it still did a really good job of not spreading the bronzer everywhere. So with some of her other bronzer brushes, which I do really love, like the Jumbo Bronze, those are really, really excellent for a very nice diffused application. Same with the Face Pro. You really don't have to do any buffing out, which is amazing. But the only downside of those is, especially if you have a smaller face and you want something a little bit more sculpting, it can be a little bit difficult to control because those brushes are just so big and wispy. So in contrast, this will definitely give you a much more targeted, chiseled application. Now this is very large, but let's see if I can use this for nose contour as well. Okay, that kind of works. Definitely a little bit big. I feel like I can't really kind of get into this upper half of my nose. It's just sort of hitting at the bottom of my nose. But in a pinch, I think I could probably use this for nose contour. But really beautiful for all over bronze. Now on the other side, let's try this with the Fan M and see how this goes. Okay. So this is interesting. This is definitely leaving more of like a sharp edge, if you guys can see. So maybe let me actually blend that out. All right. Okay, so I think you need to use these two brushes a little bit differently. This one you can use kind of at a 90-degree angle and just sweep it like this. Whereas for this one, I would recommend more kind of a sweeping motion like this, almost kind of dragging the product down instead of using it directly at a 90-degree angle. Okay, so if you use it this way, I feel like this is blending things out really, really beautifully. Super, super natural. Very nice. Oh, wow. Okay, I'm actually quite a fan of that. I think that worked really nicely. And then let me try this one for nose contour. And yeah, this is definitely a much better shape and fit. I feel like I'm able to really just use the entire brush and just sort of run that along the nose. Ooh, okay, that's really nice. I actually really like that nose contour. Nose contour is for me one of the most challenging steps. I feel like I always somehow mess it up and my nose just looks really muddy. But this brush is really, really good for this purpose. So now let's also just go in with this Fan A, even though it's not for all over bronze, but I am just curious. So I'm going to sweep this here and then use this on this side. Okay, yeah, that definitely makes a very targeted bronze. So interesting, I would say, unlike this brush where it kind of lends itself more towards that sweeping motion, this one, I think there's a little bit more area at the cross section. So it's not that easy to do it like this. It's a little bit better using it at a 90-degree angle, but that does mean that it's going to leave a little bit more of kind of intense line, which you can then, I guess, like blend out a bit like this. So I guess the application for bronzer with this brush is a little bit more like a hybrid of the others. You sort of sweep it on at a 90-degree angle and then maybe stipple or buff it out. Interesting, huh? These are the things you can't really tell when you just look at a brush online. Like, does it lend itself towards this motion or this motion or that motion? So let's try this with nose contour, which again, I feel like the other brush already did a great job, but okay, yeah, this is, I think, literally the perfect brush for nose contour. Wow, okay. Yeah, I feel like the shorter end and longer end means it's just so easy to hug your nose like this and just really have like kind of a light application of contour at the top and more targeted lower on the nose. Wow, okay, so this one is really, really nice for that application. Very, very impressed. I think this was really designed for the nose area in particular. So I think I'm actually sufficiently bronzed, but I am just very curious how these brushes would perform with a different kind of bronzer powder that's maybe a little bit less hard pressed. So I'm gonna go in now with my Gucci bronzer and the larger sculpt brush. Whoops, okay, interesting, huh? Okay, so what happened was when I sort of swept this in, a lot of bronzer powder kind of kicked up, and this picked up quite a lot. So it's probably dangerous to put this directly on, but I'm just gonna try. Okay, yeah, as you can see, that applied quite a lot. Okay, interesting. So this is exactly why we do these tests. I think this brush is extremely good at picking up sort of more firmly pressed powders, but you might want to be a little careful when using something that's less hard pressed. So like this Gucci powder, you really don't need to apply any pressure. It's much more powdery than the Chantecaille. And so for this, I think you need to just use a lighter hand and be a bit more careful. I mean, it still blends out super beautifully and easily, but for this powder, I definitely had to use a little bit more of a buffing motion instead of with the other one where it just kind of was blended the moment I applied it. So let's try that with this brush as well and kind of do what I did with the other one and apply with this motion. Okay, I think this works well. Yeah, I mean, definitely these brushes I think can work with much more powdery products. You just have to be more careful because they do just pick up quite a lot. I mean, they are designed for hard pressed pigments, and so if you have something that's not hard pressed, you're just gonna have to be careful and be prepared to do a little bit more of a buffing motion. All right, and then let's try with this guy as well. So one thing that's also a bit different when you're using a looser powder like this is you can't really sweep your entire brush across like I was able to do with the Chantecaille, just because that would be way too much pigment. And so you kind of just pick up a little bit of it, and then after that, when you first apply, it's gonna leave kind of a streak. And so that means you just need to like apply it and then buff it a bit. I guess another way of doing this would be after getting some of the powder on the brush to then sort of rub it on your hand or arm or on a palette to sort of disperse the pigment a little bit more within the brush. I think that would work quite well also. But if you do apply directly to the skin, just be prepared to do a little bit more buffing out than if you were using a hard pressed formula. So now for the Worker L, I also do want to use this for nose contour, even though my nose is already looking kind of dark, but that's okay. I have here my Charlotte Tilbury Filmstar Bronze and Glow. This is pretty light, so I'm hoping this doesn't add too much additional depth, but I'm just gonna use this on the sides of my nose. Okay, I think this is working pretty well. It's definitely a lot fluffier than the fan brushes for this nose contour area, so I think this would be good if you want a little bit more of a diffused application, but I think that worked quite nicely. Honestly, on the skin, I can't tell much of a difference between this and the Detail Pro, at least not yet, so I wouldn't necessarily, at least thus far, recommend buying both. So now for blush, I have a few different formulas here as well. So first I have this Suqqu Pure Color Blush. This is one of the formulas that Sonia G mentioned as being a part of the motivation for this fan medium brush, so I figured I would try it out. As I mentioned at the top, I don't actually find this hard to pick up with my other brushes, but I guess it's maybe a little bit harder pressed. So let's apply this with the fan brush. And I think this is applying quite well. It's actually applying a pretty sheer layer, which is kind of surprising to me, given that the point of this in theory is to be better at picking up hard pressed pigments. But I think that looks really pretty. It's interesting using this sort of motion for applying blush where it's like this and then drag down. It's different from how I typically use my brushes. But I think that's really nice. Very, very beautiful application. I also wanted to go in with my Chantecaille Wild Meadows blush. I have this in Anemone. This is also kind of similar to the bronzer, a bit more of a hard pressed formula. It's that baked gelée formula. So let's see. Okay, yeah, this is a really beautiful application as well. I'm actually really impressed that this brush doesn't apply too much pigment at once. That was something I was a little bit worried about given the description. I was thinking that it might just be too aggressive, but I think this is like the perfect level of pigmentation. So very, very nice. I'm also curious to try out the Sculpt A with these blushes, so I'm gonna kind of even out my face by first going into this with the Suqqu, and then applying this on the side where I previously applied the Chantecaille. And Yeah, I would say this is less good for blush. You can definitely use it for that purpose. But again, because I feel like with this, it wants to create lines, basically, like thick lines. It doesn't really want to do as much of like a large area. So I am finding when I use this brush, I have to spend a little bit more time kind of just sweeping it and diffusing it. I mean, it's a very negligible difference. Like, I don't think you would dislike using this for blush necessarily, but just comparing the two, this is definitely a lot faster and easier for blush and bronzer in comparison to this one. Whereas I feel like this one is like maybe a little bit better for nose contour than this one. Now let's go in on the other side with Anemone and brush this on. Also, I think the angled element of this brush is not that useful if you are using this for blush or bronzer, whereas it is very useful for nose contour, so that's another thing to consider. I feel like the symmetrical shape for the other one is a little bit more suited for these use cases. And then, do I even want to use this for blush? I feel like this might be a little intense, but why don't we just try it? So let me go in actually with the Suqqu, since that's a little bit lighter and I feel like I already have a lot of blush on my cheeks. So just take a bit. Oh, actually this is really good for this purpose. Wow, this is very fast and really good, especially if you like that blush draping, because I feel like you can do that whole C very, very fast. Wow, okay, actually this is, if you want something that is a bit more of a diffused blush application that's super, super fast, this is your brush. Huh, okay, I'm glad I tried that because that was really easy. So now let's go into highlighter. First, I have yet another baked gelée. Here is the Dior formula. And let me actually first go in with the Worker L for this. So for today's look, I'm actually gonna just use this shade because the other ones I feel like won't really fit. So let's just apply this here. Ooh, very pretty. As you guys can see, it's a lovely subtle sheen. Again, this feels exactly like using my Detail Pro, which I love. Like I said, it's one of my favorite brushes. But yeah, after all these tests, I really don't think it's different enough to justify buying this in addition, unless you just like the wood handle, but really, really nice. Basically, I think if you're debating between these two, pick the one that has the handle you like better, but they're both really, really beautiful. Okay, let's also try the Sculpt A with this product. Okay, that's really nice as well. Very, very fast and easy. Let me try this for nose highlight as well. Okay. That's very good. Again, this is just perfect for the nose. Like, this is truly the best brush I've ever experienced for anything around the nose, because this angle is just so perfect for anything where you're sliding around the nose. It's very, very well suited and designed for that purpose. Now let's try with the medium brush. Very quick and easy as well. And then let's see if we can use the large brush. So this is a little bit big for this pan, but okay, yeah, definitely quite diffused application, but this actually, it's not too big for highlight. It still actually can apply just to the tops of the cheeks. Alrighty, so here we have the final look. What do you guys think? So now for my overall initial impressions about these brushes. So first off, with the Sculpt L, this one actually turned out to be one of the most versatile brushes, which kind of surprised me because I thought this was going to be a little bit too big. I was honestly considering not buying this because it's the most expensive brush, and my face is a little bit on the smaller side because I am a short person, and so I thought that like maybe it would be better to get the smaller ones, because I do find with a lot of Sonia G brushes, the larger brushes tend to be a bit too big for my face, so I don't use them as much as I would like. But I actually found, because this one still has a relatively pinched cross section, it's actually very, very versatile for basically your entire face. I think if you want one brush to do your entire face, this is the one that I would most recommend because it's so good at a diffused but still targeted bronzer application. It's great at very fast blush and very fast highlight. So if you don't want something too detail oriented and you want to be able to use this for all three purposes, then this is excellent. Now the only thing this thing can't really do is like the nose contour, it's not that great at, so you might still need a different brush for that, but this is definitely the most versatile in terms of face products. For the Fan M, this was one that I actually ended up liking way more than I expected. So based on the descriptions, I thought this one was the one that I would like the least just because of what it was designed for. But I think it's actually extremely versatile because it can be used really nicely for bronzer, for blush, and for highlight, and for nose contour, and it's just super soft and easy to use. I was impressed how with this sort of downward sweeping motion, you can just get such a perfect blush application in particular. I think of the three brushes, this is my favorite one for blush application. But in general, if you want something that's just a little bit more targeted and controlled than this one, I feel like this is a super great option, especially if you want to prioritize having the ability to do nose contour better. For the Fan A, I would say this is definitely the most kind of specific brush in the set in terms of what it's good for. I would say that for me, I didn't like it that much for most of the face application steps. I mean, it was perfectly fine. If I wasn't comparing it directly with these other fan brushes, I would say it's still a very good brush for bronzer, blush, and highlight, but where it really stood out and was just miles better than any other brush I've tried was in the nose area. It is very much designed for fitting that area of the face, and so I think if you're someone who struggles with nose contour or just wants to kind of up your nose contour game and be a bit more targeted and sculpted there, this is truly the perfect, most well-engineered brush I've ever experienced, at least for that area of the face. I wouldn't necessarily recommend this for other purposes though. Finally, for the Worker L brush, this one I feel kind of mixed about because I feel like I basically already have this brush in my collection, so it's less exciting than the other ones. To me, it's a little bit more like I just bought another Detail Pro and got it in a snazzier handle. So it's not a total bust by any means because this is one of my favorite brushes and I don't mind having a duplicate, but it's definitely not noticeably that different on the face. That said, if you don't have the Detail Pro, I will say this is really lovely for nose contour, for highlight. It's one of my favorite brushes for those use cases. And in a pinch, you can also use this for blush if you want, especially something targeted. So it's a relatively versatile brush that can be used for a wide variety of purposes. You can also use this in the crease area if you want something super diffused, or for very targeted sculpting if you'd like. So I would recommend this if you don't already have the Detail Pro. So that's it in terms of my review of these new brushes. I would love to hear in the comments what you guys think about this new release. In particular, if you've picked up any brushes or if you had the previous brushes, I would love to hear your thoughts on these. And even if you don't have any of these brushes, I'm curious which ones you're eyeing. And if you guys like this video, please give it a thumbs up. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to my channel. Thank you all so much for joining me today, and I'll catch you next time. Bye!